Hello, everyone. I'm Arista Holmes. I hope everyone's having a good evening. Thank you, Katherine, for having me on your channel tonight. Um, so I'll be reading from my SPFBO entry, Changeling. It's a reverse portal / contemporary fantasy where our main character, Lizzie, travels through a fey portal into our current modern world. It's book one of a trilogy, and I'll be reading chapter 3 tonight. Just to give a little bit of context, though, let me start with a portion of the blurb. When Lizzie's mother is the next to vanish, she is expected to grieve and move on. Instead, Lizzie wants to find out what happened, but the answers she seeks can't be found in the Fey realm of Arbaeon. With the help of her best friend, Booker Reed, Lizzie is determined to retrace her mother's final steps straight through a portal into the mortal realm. And that's where we end up joining Lizzie at the beginning of chapter 3. They've just arrived in a small town alone. The portal behind them has closed, leaving them no way back. So now Lizzie and Booker have to figure out what they're going to do next, seeing as this is pretty much as far as Lizzie had planned. It was still the middle of the night, but the similarities ended there. When Lizzie and Booker had stepped into the fairy circle, they had been surrounded by the carefully curated collection of sacred trees. Now they were standing on a large patch of grass with the lone oak they had arrived through standing at their backs. Even the moon looked different, Lizzie noticed, hanging full and round despite the light cloud cover hiding the stars overhead. Beyond the green were what looked like streets, paved in uniform square stone slabs with lights on top of tall poles that stood at regular intervals and bathed their surroundings in pools of harsh orange light. Lizzie hesitated, glancing around as she tried to find something she recognized, but each direction looked the same. Rows of buildings stretched out into the night, further than she could see. Their doors were sealed, their windows dark, and Lizzie felt her fingers tighten on the strap of her bag as a wave of doubt crashed over her. "You have no idea which way to go, do you?" Booker groaned, and the threat of his imminent teasing banished her hesitation. Booker wouldn't let her live it down if she admitted to being lost, so she did the first thing she could think of. She lied. "Of course I do," she answered, clearing her throat and pointing towards the nearest row of orange lights. "It's this way." Without looking at Booker to see if he'd brought her bravado, Lizzie started across the green, hoping they would stumble over something she recognized before he called her on her bluff. "And what makes you so sure?" he asked, scattering her hopes to the winds even as he fell into step beside her. Lizzie forced herself to roll her eyes like she wasn't making everything up on the spot. "There are lights," she told him, "and where there are lights there are people, and if there are people, Booker, then there's going to be an inn. A hotel, and then we can stay there for the night and figure out where to go next in the morning." "With what money, Lizzie?" Booker prompted, and she shot him a glare. "I have gems to trade, of course. I'm not a complete idiot." "Did you fail the class on the mortal realm by any chance?" "Why?" she asked sharply, coming to an abrupt stop, her suspicion rising at the amusement in Booker's voice. And when she turned to face him, his green eyes were almost glimmering with barely restrained laughter. "Because humans don't work in trade anymore. Unless we can find some kind of jewelers to sell them to tomorrow, those gems of yours are worthless here." Lizzie stared at Booker for a long moment, disbelief battling with despair in her chest, before her shoulders slumped and her eyes slid closed. "Tell me you're joking," she pleaded, but her friend's quiet laughter said he wasn't. "How did I not know that? And stop laughing," she added, voice sharp as she slapped the back of her hand against his arm. But the reprimand did nothing to smother his amusement. "What are we going to do?" Lizzie moaned. Pushing her hair off her face with a groan, she struggled to reorganize her plan. If her gems were useless for bartering, then everything was at risk of disintegrating before it even began. "This was your idea. Why do I have to come up with a solution?" Booker shot back, still grinning. Despite his words, he slung an arm around her shoulders and tugged her into his side reassuringly, starting them both walking towards the street once more. "Well, you're now the self-appointed brains of the operation," Lizzie muttered, calming under the comforting weight of Booker's arm. Trusting him to find a solution to their current dilemma, she continued her earlier observations of the human town they'd found themselves in the middle of. The portal they had arrived through seemed to be acting as a sort of central point of the town, and Lizzie felt a rush of relief that they had arrived in the middle of the night. While humans couldn't perceive fey magic, a couple of teens crawling across the grass in open panic might have raised a few eyebrows. As the pair of them stepped off the grass and onto the smooth stone slabs that seemed to pave the street, she began to study the buildings more closely. They were all uniformly rectangular, but put together with red brick, and there wasn't a single thatched roof in sight. They didn't look residential to her, but it was becoming clear her knowledge of the mortal realm might not be as solid as she had believed it to be. Beyond the fact her gems were useless, nothing around them looked familiar. Nothing like her teacher, Master Wayland, had described in his lessons, and she glanced back at Booker, her curiosity piqued. "How do you know so much about the mortal realm anyway?" she asked. "You didn't even take that class." "I didn't take it because Wayland is an idiot who's never set foot here," Booker muttered. He glanced around briefly before turning them both down a street that, to Lizzie, looked no different than all the others. "I read my dad's journals," Booker continued, his voice growing soft and quiet. "He and Mum came here a lot, especially when they were trying to convince the court to re-implement regular contact." "Ah." Lizzie couldn't think of anything else to say. Booker didn't talk about his parents often, and she didn't want to press him further. Instead, she slipped her arm around his waist in silent support and accepted the gentle squeeze around her shoulders as wordless thanks. They moved down the street, their footsteps against the damp pavement the only sound disturbing the night air, until Booker huffed out a soft sigh. "So I'm thinking, if we wander around the town tonight, we can try and spot a store that looks like it might buy your gems. That'll let us familiarize ourselves with the layout a bit too, so we don't get hopelessly lost every time we turn a corner," Booker began slowly. "Once we've got some of the local currency, we can find somewhere for breakfast and ask about a hotel. That could give us somewhere to sleep while we figure out where to go next." Sound considered Booker's plan, stepping over a small puddle that had collected in a dip on the pavement. She glanced up at the sky again, but the clouds had grown thicker as they'd walked, coating the moon in inky shadows. It wasn't raining, but the damp night air had already sunk through her light linen clothes and settled against her skin. "It sounds miserable in this weather," she grumbled, wrinkling her nose in distaste. "But what choice do we have?" Lizzie's voice trailed off as a sudden chill raced along her spine. For a second, she thought it might be nothing more than the cool night air, an unexpected breeze against her damp skin. But then she heard a sound behind them, the slap of something against the stone that she almost put down to their footsteps bouncing off the buildings. Only it echoed wrong, a little too fast, a little too soft. Lizzie stopped and turned, Booker's arm falling away from her shoulders. But despite the almost ominous orange glow of the lights lining the street behind them, Lizzie couldn't see anything out of place. When the sound she'd been hearing abruptly stopped, her skin began to crawl. "What is it?" Booker asked, his voice quiet and wary, and Lizzie knew he was reacting to her tension. "I think someone might be following us. The portal deactivated and no one knows we're here." Despite his reassurances, Booker's voice had dropped to an anxious whisper, and Lizzie swallowed, shaking her head while she continued to scan the street behind them for any sign of movement or a shadow out of place. "I don't think it's Faye," she told him, voice just as quiet before taking a step back and bumping into Booker, pressing her frame against his in an attempt to make him move without having to tear her eyes away from the street. "A human. Lizzie, let's just go," she pleaded, fear bubbling up through her stomach, burning her throat. She didn't want to argue, she wanted to run. Lizzie didn't know what she was afraid of, but she couldn't fight it off either. "Please, Booker." A nerve-wracking moment of silence followed her request before Booker grabbed her hand and tugged her around with a quiet, "All right, this way." He quickly led them down more streets, taking seemingly random turns, and within moments Lizzie felt hopelessly lost. She wouldn't have been able to find her way back to the portal if she'd wanted to. The moment they'd continued walking, the strange slapping sound had returned, faster now and close enough to make her shiver. Lizzie kept sending anxious glances over her shoulder, trusting Booker to tug her through the maze-like town. Without warning, the sound changed. It seemed to overtake them, and Lizzie ground to a halt. They were in the middle of a cobblestone street that passed between two buildings, the narrow pathway only a little wider than Lizzie and Booker walking side by side, and with no space for the regular orange streetlights that had seemed so eerie only 10 minutes ago. Despite the close quarters, they had somehow been overtaken, and Lizzie turned to stare up at the rooftops as the answer came to her too late. It had only taken a moment and Lizzie's hand slipping out of his grasp for Booker to notice that she'd ground to a halt. He turned back to check on her, eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" he demanded, voice still quiet but filled with urgency. "What are you looking at?" Lizzie didn't answer him. It didn't matter that they'd been tracked from the rooftops, not when the person trailing them had moved ahead. Lizzie dropped her gaze from the buildings, staring down at the end of the narrow street. Booker turned to follow her gaze and immediately backed up to stand beside her. The glow of the orange streetlights ahead of them were no longer ominous but reassuring. It summoned a desire in Lizzie to step closer, to seek out the safety of a well-lit area, but their path forward had become blocked. A woman stood at the far end of the alley, her hands clasped against the small of her back, with the narrow street opening out behind her into a fresh part of town. It was as beyond their reach as the portal back to Arbaean. Before Lizzie could summon her voice to call out, the stranger began to move closer, one slow step at a time. Bright blonde hair hung around her face in long, lank strands and swayed with her movements. As she approached, Lizzie felt her heart rise to sit in her throat. The source of the sound that had been following them through the town became obvious, and she found herself staring at the woman's bare feet, mesmerized and horrified as they slapped against the damp ground. A dark dress fell to the stranger's knees and merged with the shadows cast by the buildings on either side of them as she approached. Her head tilted to one side as though curious, but twisted too far over in an unnatural manner, and everything about her made Lizzie's skin crawl. "I don't know what I did to get this lucky," the woman purred before suddenly giggling like a child, her hands springing up from her sides fast enough to make Lizzie flinch back and press against Booker's side. Lizzie's fearful reaction didn't seem to have any effect on the woman, and she tangled her fingers together and pressed her hands to her chest. She continued her slow, measured approach, but with each steady step she twisted her body, back and forth, swaying until her skirt spun around her knees, giving a deceptively innocent appearance. As she moved closer, Lizzie realized her light blonde hair almost gave the woman the appearance of a fae, but the unrestrained manic glee in her bloodshot eyes and the twisted expression creeping over her face placed her firmly on the wrong side of terrifying. Neither Lizzie nor Booker needed the connection of telepathy to begin retreating as one, but the strange woman didn't change her pace, only matching their movements and releasing a delighted laugh. "Where are you going?" she snarled darkly, snapping from amused to furious in a heartbeat, and tilting her head to the opposite side. The movement made her seem even more broken, like her neck had no support. The angles reminded Lizzie of a puppet with its strings cut. "Don't you want to play?" Her voice shifted from its dangerous growling into a high-pitched, almost sing-song tone. She began to chant then, a chilling rhyme, hopping onto a new stone pavement slab with each beat of her song, advancing ever closer, and Lizzie felt her hands begin to shake. "Two young fey blood walking along the street. How will I choose which to eat? Knock them out and break the boy, then turn the girl into this month's toy." "A vampire," Booker breathed, and Lizzie almost stumbled, her limbs shaking with the desire to turn and run. But it was too late now. The vampire was close enough Lizzie could see the sharp teeth of a predator behind the woman's delighted grin, and a second later she lunged. And that's the end of chapter 3. If you'd like to find out what other kind of trouble that Lizzie and Booker get into, Changeling is available in ebook, paperback, and hardback. I think Katherine's been kind enough to put the link in the description box below. Thank you. And the hardback version comes with some lovely black chapter pages. Thank you again, Katherine, for having me on your channel tonight, and I hope everyone enjoyed that little taste of Changeling and has a good night.